Morgan,
That's right.
and James, I think, was the one.
And what's their last name?
Earp. Well, there's the Earps and the Clantons.
The Clantons,
yeah.
Which is a lot like Glanton, right? I was thinking that. I was like, it rhymes with Glanton. But anyway, nice segue between our previous one.
Yeah. So we're here talking about My Darling Clementine. John Ford's, what is it, 1946?
That's right.
Classic Western? Yeah.
And no, the timing is interesting. I mean, it kind of is what informed a little bit of our even wanting to talk a bit about My Darling Clementine, because 1946 is also, it's post-World War II, and it's at the moment where the noir, as a kind of phenomenon filmically, explodes.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about timing, and when I made the remark that My Darling Clementine kind of feels like a noirish Western, which is a marrying of two genres very early, because the noir would be being born at this moment.
I mean, like the noir films were being made, but like the French came up with that name because they hadn't been seeing movies, American movies, during World War II.
That's right. Double Indemnity, Laura, Maltese Falcon.
Yeah, and John Ford and Henry Fonda from this movie were both in the war, and this is like their comeback, I guess, from that.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Just as a quick side note, one of the real tensions between John Ford and John Wayne, who has nothing to do with this film, but he has been in previous ones we talked about, Stagecoach, etc., is Wayne didn't go to the war. He basically sidestepped World War II, and I think John Ford basically was like, how can you be America's everyman and not go to war? And I think that's something that haunted Wayne all of his life, for all his machismo and all his kind of, larger than life figure of the American West. He did not go to World War II.
How did he get out of it?
I was reading it on a PBS site, and basically because he had kids and pull and a certain amount of money and his family life, I think he basically sidestepped it. Now, how? I don't know. That would be something we need to read into more, but he definitely did.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm blanking on the name of the one. High Noon.
Yeah. Exactly.
John Wayne was, I guess, instrumental in running the author of that out of the country.
Yeah.
He actually brags about it.
Yeah. And he called that an un-American film, whole, I've never seen such an un-American film in my life. And here is a guy who didn't go to the Great War, you know what I mean? And fight on the side of right and true. And, there was no, that's one of the few wars where it was this was a good cause and worthy to lay your life down to stop a tyrannical, genocidal maniac. And, he didn't. Interesting, right? I mean, I'm fascinated by the whole John Wayne figure. I do find him interesting in a lot of ways. He's one of the things that brought me back into the Western in the 90s. But I think it's even more interesting to think about his, like you said, runnings in and out and doing all these things about, X, Y, and Z, but at the same time, was not part of the Great Generation in that way.
Yeah. Interesting.
And he could have been. He was certainly of age.
Yeah. Huh. So I said before, my introduction to the Western was Yosemite Sam. But another one was where I learned about the gunfight at OK Corral was from Star Trek. If you remember where Captain Kirk and crew they got thrust into the role of the Clanton gang. So look at my Darling Clementine. It's like, oh wait, those were the bad guys, because it's not the way I remember it.
It's interesting too because I saw this film at UCLA when I wasn't a film student. My girlfriend at the time was, and so she was taking a class on the Western, and the class started with Stagecoach, and my Darling Clementine was like the second or third film they watched, all the way up to like Unforgiven, right? So it was like, it was like a look at the Western over decades, and I was struck very much by this film because just how mean the Clanton ones were. Like the Clantons are mean. They're evil. Like the shooting in the back, the father saying, if you're going to pull a gun on a man, shoot him, kill him, right? Like just a morbid family.
Horse whipping his kids. Yeah.
I mean, exactly. I mean, he's a great figure in that John Ford caricature way, but he's also just evil, and his kids are evil. And then you have Doc Holliday, which I didn't really know what to do with. Like he was a Shakespeare quoter. He was, obviously from money back east, but at the same time, he was this really dark, haunted, existential figure, very much a la noir. And then you have, who's just brilliant in it, Henry Fonda, who's just kind of an opportunist, who's pissed, not opportunist, like, he's pissed. His brother was shot in the back by these Clanton bastards, and he wanted to seek revenge. And at the same time, he falls in love. But like, he's kind of this light figure that like grounds everything. But like, I loved it, for me, just how complex the whole world was between the Clantons, between Doc Holliday, and between Wyatt Earp. And I was thinking of it as I was watching it this time around, just the colors and this really kind of like black and white use. And just look at it compared to another Western, for example, like Stagecoach. Stagecoach is wide and it's bright and the sky is everywhere. And there's this really definitive sense of the Western as space. My Darling Clementine is not that at all. It's kind of smaller spaces, darker. You're stuck within these saloons. There's these crevices. There's people up in these little kind of lodging houses that jump out windows. And it's just a very different sense of space. For me, very much informed by these sense of spaces, whether it be the kind of like halfway houses or these kind of inner urban cities that you see in the noir. And I just started to make the connection, not that it's a definitive connection or that it makes a lot of sense, but for me, as we've done a lot of work on noir, I was like, my Darling Clementine is a bit of a Western noir.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking of was, true crime.
Yeah.
Because, the gunfight at OK Corral, that's an actual thing. Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp and the Clanton gangs, those are real people. But we also look at like what's the true in true crime, and this movie basically comes from Stuart's like book on Wyatt Earp, which, as people have gone back and investigated it, is largely fiction. Apparently Earp told his biographer Stuart Lake, and apparently Earp retired to Los Angeles and would hang around film sets. So allegedly met John Ford in his silent movie days.
Fascinating.
This came through in the commentary track on My Darling Clementine, that a lot of Old West lawmen, gunfighter, cattle rustlers did the same thing. They would go to Hollywood and act as technical advisors, on the sets. Bit parts and things like that.
I saw that recently on, who was it? It was one of the figures of the Mexican Revolution, who was actually got his entire, was it Zapata? Or was it the other? There were two major figures of that revolution who were part of it, who basically went to Hollywood and got their start and kind of their exploration. Maybe it wasn't Zapata, maybe it was the other one. I'm forgetting on the name. I looked at it when I was doing the research on some of the stuff we did with Blood Meridian. But it was funny that they went to Mexico. I mean, the Mexican kind of figures of that revolution went to Hollywood to actually promote their cause. It's fascinating, right?
So they know the value of propaganda.
Absolutely. Early on.
Yeah. So that whole like truth versus fiction thing, comes through because some people criticized John Ford for taking a lot of liberties with the story here. But it's a story that was not quite true to begin with, Wyatt Earp, embellished his own legend. I was looking at like his career. I mean, they show him as a cattleman and as a marshal, and apparently he was a marshal before. Apparently he was also a gambler, and a pimp and a criminal.
The whole gamut.
The whole Wild West, yeah. Across the board, yeah.
The figure I was thinking of from the Mexican Revolution was Pancho Villa. So just
Pancho Villa, okay, yeah.
So he went to Hollywood too and reshaped the whole image of that. But I mean, it's interesting in regards to what you're saying with Wyatt Earp is how do we, how does the figure of Hollywood as a myth machine around the West, start to kind of become, something that's both celebrated and mythologized, but then at the same time used as its own, how would you say, deconstruction of that entire history, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's an interesting kind of like, because if you follow the course of the Western long enough, right, you spend your time challenging a lot of those assumptions.
Yeah. And we look at some other ones like Liberty Valance, the idea of like the legend and the truth. And I think it was like one of the editors in the paper says, when the fact meets the legend, you print the legend, basically. The other thing reminded me of was like over the weekend I watched Lone Star. Do you know that one?
I do know that one. That's the one who was by John Sayles.
John Sayles did it, yeah. And
yeah, I liked it a lot.
Christopherson and McConaughey.
That's right. And Chris Cooper?
Yeah.
That's right.
It brings up, I mean, it's all about history, and like there's the true history and there's the history people know and the history people don't want to know, and all those tensions in there. And I see that playing out in Clementine, in Blood Meridian.
Blood Meridian, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, Liberty Valance touches on the same thing. There's a true story. There's a story that people know, and maybe the legend is better for people to know.
Yeah, and even I mean, to some degree, another working of John Wayne is watching his career as a Western star basically end with The Shootist and end with his own rethinking of his role as, the end of his roles as a kind of, as a figure, as growing old, as this kind of myth versus what really happened. I mean, The Unforgiven is great, right? Like the Duke of Death, the Duck of Death, and how the Duck of Death has his biographer with him, writing the story versus what really happened. And that's like, one of the Unforgiven as a great revisionist Western where he's really pushing, Clint Eastwood that is really pushing on the idea of, what really happened and what gets written versus, the horrific realities of what really happened, which, like you said, brings us right to Blood Meridian, right? Like the legend versus, the mythos versus the horrific realities of, a band of outlaws just basically, scalping anything they can for a buck is horrific.
Yeah. And then, I mean, that myth making goes back before Hollywood, right? I can't remember the name of the guy or the thing he wrote, but in the late 1800s, someone set up this idea, the myth of the West, that this is what created and strengthened American democracy.
Frederick Jackson Turner.
Yeah, that's it.
Absolutely. And his whole idea was that, right? Like, it's the idea of the Western frontier that defined who we are as a people, right?
Yeah.
And that still holds, I think. I mean, I think a lot of people believe to some degree in this frontier thesis of, like that idea of space and time and the creation of the American sense of, this American exceptionalism, which has been critiqued greatly in the 20th century and for good reason. Yeah. But like this was a kind of a cornerstone of that mythos. I think it was, in the early 19th century that he started building this idea. Early 20th century.
Yeah. Because he was like, I want to say 1890s or whatever, maybe.
That's right. I think he actually comes out with it in the 1890s, 1893 even.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Because there's like, the good and bad to that. And maybe they're both true, right?
Yeah.
But we focus on the one we want to see.
Well, I mean, I think, but it's interesting too, because for me, that's part of the interesting crossover, right? Is the crossover of the frontier myth, and like he does that, he gives it supposedly at the World Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, which is a formative moment, right, for thinking and for the American imagination, for the future of technology, all this stuff. But cut to like, at least genre moments, right? So that's a great moment in the kind of definition of what this genre of the Western would mean for us as a nation, and even more broadly for the world, as understanding what America is as a nation, a gunslinging country. So cut to 1946 when you have My Darling Clementine, and cut to this crossover with what would be another definitive genre to define the post-war nation, dealing with a crisis of existentialism, dealing with what would be continental philosophy of, this godless nation that has to come to terms with its blood, that has to come to terms with this history. And you can start seeing noir as one of the ways in which that Nietzschean notion of morality and, coming to terms with, I think, a lot of what we saw in the 30s with the Depression and the post, I still make that argument that, I believe that what you had in the 30s, and this is an interesting thesis I heard recently, and it kind of backs up some of the thinking we did when we did the hard-boiled class dealing with John Fonte. John Fonte is an early hard-boiled, kind of noir thinker or noir writer. And the argument was, by this recent documentary I saw on the noir, which was actually run by Elroy, and it's interesting. It's called LA Noir or something. This theorist said, basically, noir was a result of having not dealt with the Depression. So you had this, world crisis of depression in the 30s, and then you get to 1940 when they're starting to come out of the Depression, and everything changes because you're in this 5-year, global conflict where everybody has to just change, but there's a common purpose and a common sense of that. And so what's put on hiatus for that 5 or 6 years or 7 years when you're dealing with this kind of Nazi kind of explosion of the Axis is you're never having dealt with the kind of financial, fiscal, and uncertainty principle that was brought to be by the Great Depression. And so for him, noir is a rethinking, is a logical extension of everything that wasn't dealt with during the 30s. Okay. And it's an interesting theory. I don't know whether it's right or not, I don't know, but it's this theory that, all that kind of existential crisis, all that kind of uncertainty, all the shadows of, any sense of stability in our sense of the world and who's right, who's wrong, what's good, what's bad, is a result of a very physical, a very kind of economic, a very social reality that everyone suffered through in the 30s. And so this generation coming of age, not to mention the crisis that happened in Germany and Europe and Asia and beyond. But you have this kind of coming to bear of, you know, a kind of economic sense of the world and its instability, which is, you know, very interesting when you think about the Western, right? Because the Western is the premise of that very kind of faulty economic system. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Because out of the 30s, it's noir is dealing with like the corruption that's underlying a lot of things that led to that, right? Yeah. And I mean, you can see the same kind of lawlessness going on in My Darling Clementine, because you got the Klan gang apparently operating openly. Doc Holliday, I don't know what he's into, but he's known for like leaving bodies in graveyards across the country. They say he runs the town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the civilizing impact of culture as a way to hide. Like, I love that culture becomes the patina to hide the horror beneath it, right? Like, you know, you say a little bit of lines of Shakespeare, and you have this figure who's, I mean, that great figure of the kind of the thespian who comes in, who's a drunk. They want to hang him tar and feather because he can't deliver. But this notion of this clamoring for culture, right? In some ways, to dress up and hide the stark realities of Wyatt Earp and the Clanton gang and the kind of, like, you know, very apparent and, like you see in Blood Meridian, horrific undergirding of this, you know, mythos of the West. And what I love about My Darling Clementine is there are certain moments where that mythos gives in. Like, I think there are moments when, like, you can see through it, like the Doc Holliday, right? Like his very dark, his kind of rage between one extreme and the other. And Wyatt Earp is this kind of pacifying effect on this. But like Wyatt Earp just seems like in some degrees, like an afterthought, right? Like, he comes in, he's trying to you know, revenge his brother, but he can never really, like, he's basically pushing forward with the civilizing instinct with Doc Holliday's girl. He's sitting around, he's doing his dance, and his brothers are laughing, right? Like, there's that sense that he's kind of part of that. But I never get the sense, at least for me, of Doc Holliday, I mean, of Wyatt Earp, as more than just that, like just a figure of kind of like a patina on top of what's really driving this kind of horror of the West, whether it be Doc Holliday and the Clantons. You know, I don't know, maybe that's wrong of me, but he just seems to me like almost, you know, this patina of normalcy, this patina of what's to come. But what really is defining it and undergirding it, like with the noir, is this deep, horrific capital, you know, corruption, and, you know, based on blood, right? Like, you know, redemption written in blood.
Yeah. I was reading, like, the movie makes this conflict about his brother. But like historically, the conflict between the Clantons and the Earps was actually like political. That Earp was aligned with like the Chamber of Commerce and that level of that, and the Clantons were part of the cattlemen, the working class, basically.
Interesting. So there's a whole nother on top of it, like civilizing as a way to kind of claim the land. You have that a lot with Morricone, right? Like in Once Upon a Time in the West, as the train comes through, right? Figures like Jason Robards and even Henry Fonda, who's this one-time plays a bad guy in his Western career, which is an interesting look at that.
Yeah.
You know, that's a very clear story of the railroads, very clearly, you know, trying to consolidate their power and their wealth at the expense of everybody and everything.
Yeah.
Right? There's no holes barred in those. That's just how it is, which is very different than what you get in Clementine. Although I do think Clementine, like, it's there. Like, it's not really hidden that much. You know what I mean? It's got the kind of, you know, and I don't want to speak I love Henry Fonda in this, so I don't want to like, discount him. But he's kind of the clean face everything lives through, right? And he's the kind of the moralizing, civilizing face, but I think really just a face.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that struck me about it, when we talk about the noir, the shadows and that, was also like Ford's photography.
Yeah.
I forget the name of the cinematographer, but so many shots were like almost static images. Like the camera doesn't move.
Yeah.
The character's in one spot. Which is why I made like that whole series of GIFs about it, because they're all kind of like right there. Let's see if I can do that.
I think the cinematographer was Joseph McDonald.
Yeah, McDonald, right. So let's see. Can I share my...
Let's see. You're living in a little bit of noir backdrop there.
Yeah, because I'm not moving, so the lights went out. So let's see if I can share my Tumblr here. There we go.
Yeah, I see him. Nice. With the flag.
So yeah, I took a lot of these shots and just tried to like mask out parts because the way that they were working, you really could.
Yeah, that's great. The one with the feet. That is actually one of the ones I thought of. That's really well done, by the way. That's one of the ones I thought of as I was thinking about the noir, is his back and forth on that chair, just kind of like sitting there, kind of this dark figure, right, on the porch waiting for stuff to happen. I was really struck by that.
Yeah, it's very subtle, but he's like performing this delicate balancing act here.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's because he's supposed to be law and order, but he's there for revenge.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Doc Holliday with his drinking problem.
Yeah, that's brilliant. That's really well done.
Well, it was so easy to do because the way the shots were just so static like that, composed, I love this one. This is Doc Holliday looking out the window.
Absolutely. And look at the shadows, right? I mean, that could be out of, Night of the Hunter. Yeah. Or it's just really like, a brooding dark Western just by the shooting.
Yeah. Yeah. Doc Holliday again with Clementine.
Yeah.
And the barber.
That's awesome.
Let's see. Oh, and then there's the scene at the grave. I think this was his Henry Fonda's longest speech in the entire movie, where he's talking to his brother who was killed and is buried there. He's talking to the headstone. It struck me because of like the stark black and white, the big sky, the contrast is just the beautiful use of like colors and deep gray tones.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I just found out this morning that Ford didn't do this scene. The producer had it stuck in afterwards.
Wow.
Yeah. Like someone else wrote it, and the producer had another director put it in and re-edited it later. Yeah.
That's awesome. No, I think what that really pulls away, just those, 5 or 6 GIFs, is, the tone of it. Like, not only the color tone, but like the tone, this kind of dark tone. Doc Holliday, for me, really steals the show here. And it's funny because Doc Holliday, Victor Mature, is actually an immigrant from Italy, from the area I'm in right now, from Trento.
Really?
So he's a local hero. He's one of the figures of this area of Trentino that kind of made it big in Hollywood. And this probably one of his biggest roles. And I think so whenever we watch it, there's always that for me, that localness of a Trentino actor made it big in one of the best Westerns, I think, arguably, or one of the more interesting ones in terms of its time period and what it's doing. But it's interesting. And his relationship, right? So like in some ways, we talked about Henry Fonda. I love that idea of he's there for revenge as much as he's trying to be law and order, right? He's there to kill the Clanton gang for his brother. But then this figure of Doc Holliday, right? Like this figure of his relationship with Chihuahua, which is, unhealthy to say the least. And also with Clementine, which equally unhealthy in different ways. But like you have these, and I mentioned it before, like you have these kind of two poles. You have Chihuahua, who becomes in some ways the femme fatale, right? Who kind of tries to get back at Doc Holliday, and that getting back at Doc Holliday ultimately results in, her getting shot, and, the kind of, although it's not him getting shot, it's her getting shot, it still results in, her betrayal. And that's an interesting moment in the relationship. Also, you start dealing with questions of race, right? Because you have this very, this figure who's very much the other. And then you have Clementine, who's not the good girl, who doesn't do any wrong, and who ultimately Henry Fonda becomes enamored of. And there's a suggestion of a relationship. Those two poles of these different women, which we see again in famous noirs like Out of the Past, right? Where you have, Jane Greer, who's this kind of femme fatale, to the nth degree. And then, the woman who he should be in love with, who he's not. And there's, maybe I'm drawing too strong a relationship there, but like even the kind of way in which, women in this film kind of align to some degree with the poles of, good and evil that, the characters in the actual film are fighting with are interesting. You know what I mean? Or at least map a little bit on top of that noir notion.
Yeah. Yeah, the good and evil, like the angel and the devil on the shoulder. Clementine's trying to get Holiday to go back to the life he left back east, and Chihuahua is like drawn to him because he runs the town, and
because of power, and and also I think there's a real relationship there. It's funny as it's not. Like I do think there's something there, but he's just such a broken figure. You know what I mean? Like a lot of it is, he is also a completely broken figure. But this idea of Clementine, right? The name of the film, the name of the song, like her as this ultimately think of as this kind of civilizing figure, right? She's going to be the school teacher there. She's going to bring in a whole new kind of a world of culture and that patina of culture we talk about. So Clementine becomes in some ways the savior of this space in her relationship to, an alternative to Chihuahua, which has all sorts of political baggage and racial baggage with it. There's no question about it. So even that, like you have one of the things that's interesting, and we talked about Out of the Past, is a lot of times you get these alternative scenarios, these alternative kind of, what would we say, sceneries. One of the alternative sceneries in particular in Out of the Past is Mexico, right? Robert Mitchum goes down to Mexico, and that's where he meets Jane Greer, and that's where they're on this kind of alternative world, right? And it's a world that ultimately they have to go back to this normalizing sense of America. And like you see that in these Westerns. We talked about it with, the Mexican Revolution, with the Blood Meridian, and that notion of Mexico and America, and that kind of formation of the nation as an identity, like Jackson Frederick, like Turn was talking about. Well, this film is very much about that mentality, but I think the darkness and the existential crisis at the heart of it, which is what's so great about the noir, if you watch it, it kind of it doesn't go away, right? Like there's no sense of it leaving. It's just kind of like, and there's no real, like, if you think about the ending, right? The brother says goodbye, and there's that weird moment, like what's happening, and the brother leaves. And then he comes up and he says goodbye with that sense of he'll be back through. But like even the opening, the ending is not like they get married, they come together. There's a sense like there's a lot of room for other possibilities there.
Yeah. So I pulled this one scene. Let me see if I can get this to play through.
I can see it. I just can't hear it.
You can't hear it?
I can't hear it. I can see it, though.
And he's basically saying so long to his brothers as they're riding into Tombstone.
Exactly.
There we go. And when I first watched it, my first reaction is like, this is goofy, stupid kid. The way he's just saying, so long, Wyatt, so long, Virgil. And then I'm like, okay, this kid's a goner for sure. Just the way they stays there and the way it lingers on him afterwards. Remember in The Wire, Simon talked about that sometimes they would like hold a scene for an extra beat.
Yeah.
For certain effects there. And you get the same thing here. Like, this is basically the last time we see this character. The next time he shows up, he's dead in a puddle. And I guess what it's showing is, like, at first I thought it was goofy, and then I think about it, it's like actually like poetic, that, the goodbye, you're never going to see me again kind of thing going through there, foreshadowing. And that's something that comes through the whole movie, is like the poetry that's in Ford's direction there. And I was reading up on this film, like compared it to Stagecoach. Apparently this was, My Darling Clementine was John Ford's second talking Western after Stagecoach.
Yeah.
Because there was a war in between that kind of interrupted his career.
Right.
I was saying, like, Stagecoach was a great film, but that's great prose, whereas Clementine is poetry.
Yeah, and you could see that. Like, another thing that struck me about something that Elroy said about the noir in this documentary I saw recently about the LA noir. He said, the thing about noirs is it always seems like you're in someone else's dream, right? Like, it seems like, between the lighting and this, usually someone's under effect of something or some kind of their passion play. And like, it's like you're in someone else's mind or someone else's kind of dream, which I think that's like a Kafka novel, right? Like, he writes a dream. Very hard to do. That's how I felt about Clementine. Between the notion of the lighting and this notion and this kind of the more kind of dark and maintained vision of this, like, so if you complain prose, you have the ability with prose is you can go on and the sentences can get longer and longer and the sky can get bigger and bigger. Poetry, right? You get tighter and tighter and more focused, and the figures are more precise and the language is far less verbose. And that's kind of how I felt when Elroy was saying about the noir. It's another thing that struck me about this film is it's tighter, it's more focused on the characters, but also less gets said. And you have this not notion of expanse, but this notion of very kind of really focusing in on these characters and their issues and their struggles. But again, you never feel like you're outside of a dream vision. Like, Tombstone seems like a very small place, right? And like, it's interesting to me, like, when he said that, how much that struck me, how that element of the noir travels over here, and how that notion of poetry, like you're saying, part of that is the kind of bringing it down not into long extended paragraphs, but to precise stanzas of action, right? Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah. I mean, well, there's two things there. One is like the closedness. There are like the outdoor scenes where you see the big sky, you see Monument Valley, all that. But that makes a nice and really effective contrast with the closed-in town, the interior scenes, the close-up shots. And the other thing, we talk about paring it down. I was reading, like, Ford worked with the script writer to cut down, make Henry Fonda say less,
Yeah.
give him fewer lines. Like, he has to act through the glances, through his movements, and not his words. And like I said, that one long speech was something that the producer stuck in
Yeah.
afterwards.
Interesting.
And that's poetic, right? Because it's concise, direct language, but also going back to Elroy, like, one of the issues he had, what is this record? His novels just got so big that they were unmanageable. I mean, they're huge anyway.
Yeah.
But I think it was L.A. Confidential. He finished writing it, and it's like 1,200 pages or whatever, which is ridiculous. So he went in sentence by sentence and cut out as many words as he could of each line, and that's like the evolution of his writing style.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, and it goes to, I love that idea of, like, the long dialogue put in after the fact and him focusing in on that. And I mean, I don't know. I think if you look at, it's interesting also that this would be his second film after Stagecoach, with the interval of World War II. But, like, he went through World War II, right? And a lot of people strike, I mean, there's a thesis about the Depression and the noir. We could run with that. But there's also the thesis, and it's, for me, a still compelling one, is, once you live through World War II and you live through the kind of, a moment, psychologically and historically like that, which is monumental, it changes. Right? It changes the way you think about things. It changes the notions of good and evil, maybe. It upsets what's possible in the human heart. Like, it upsets a lot of things. And a lot of the directors outside of Ford who came to the noir, right, were from Germany or from Austria, were Jews who were fighting and running from, this horrific power. So, like, that's got to play into it too. Like, I wonder if even that mentality of the noir from 38 with Stagecoach to 46, and that intervening, 8 years, something happens to Ford and his sense of what the Western could be and what the Western means in light of this historical event. It's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that.
Yeah, well, and a lot of those European directors, they've got, they came with that whole meat grinder of World War I fresh in their mind as well.
Exactly.
I mean, we were there, but we show up at the tail end and cleaned everything up, whereas the Germans and the French had to live through that for 4 years.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, brutal. No, it's interesting. I mean, and it's interesting. I love the interplay of, the West and the U.S. and Europe in relationship to that culture machine, because, very much, Hollywood is definitely part of that triangulation, transatlantic history. And to think of the Western and the noir, maybe as My Darling Clementine, as one of the crossovers between these two genres, is just interesting. I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, but it certainly, when I was watching it this time, struck me.
Yeah, I mean, visually it's there. Yeah.
It is. And maybe, like you're saying, even with the kind of, there's the irony, right? Like, after Auschwitz, there can be no poetry, right? I mean, a famous line. That's interesting in the face of that, right? You have someone like Ford who's trying to become more poetic with the Western, more trimmed down, saying less and kind of trying to show more. To what end, I don't know. I mean, why? That's probably a whole nother discussion. But it's fascinating, right, to think about that.
There was an interesting scene in there. It was like Chihuahua gets shot, Doc Holliday operates.
Yeah.
Operation seems to be successful, and they stop to celebrate at the bar. And one of those shots I had was from that. And then there's an exchange between Henry Fonda and the bartender. As Doc Holliday leaves, he, says something to Clementine at the door. And Henry Fonda turns to the bartender. He's like, have you ever been in love? And the bartender responds, no, I've been a bartender all my life. And, well, yeah, you laugh because it really is like comic relief, but it comes like at a very serious moment in there, and there is no laugh track. There's no laughter. They don't even smile, in that exchange. It just stays dark and it like lingers on it again for a while. I'm not sure what to make of that. I mean, it is comic relief, but it's not treated as such,
No. It almost stands as a moment of absurdity, right?
Yeah.
Like this absurd, almost non sequitur in the middle of this. Yeah. It's interesting. That is very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. That scene struck me at the time, but I didn't hold on to it. But if you think about it in retrospect, and just kind of what's happening there, and then we find out, in fact, Chihuahua doesn't live. The surgery is a failure, right? And Henry Fonda or Wyatt Earp very much concerned with what's going to happen between him and Clementine, right? Like that's where that question I think comes out of in some ways, right? Like there's also that sense of like, how do we feel about Henry Fonda's relationship to Clementine and relationship to Doc Holliday, right? Like there's also this weird, at least for me, this weird love triangle going on, that's not really talked about too much. And it's almost as if the bartenders say, like the only safe thing is to say, like, completely stay outside of that.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like Love Polygon, because you've got Doc Holliday, and he's got Chihuahua and Clementine, who came there looking for him. I mean, she'd been searching the whole West trying to find him, and then Henry Fonda in there as well, where he has this relationship with Doc Holliday, which starts off tense and becomes friendship, and he's got this relationship with Chihuahua, which was never positive.
Yeah, quite the opposite.
Clementine is looking for Holliday, who doesn't want her, wants her to leave. Henry Fonda wants her to stay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you got like that four-way tension there.
Yeah, and it is, and it's effective. And the idea that you would come to the, to bring this, bartender in, and he'd basically be like, like, nope, let's not talk about love, right? Like I've always been a bartender, which is interesting to think, what that means, the idea of what a bartender means in the context of the 19th century West versus maybe in New York City at a pub, right? Like it might be a very different context. Like your life, you have no time for love, given your life is always on the line. Although, overreading. But I like the absurd element of it. What I like is what you point out. Like, there's no laugh track, there's no comic relief. It's just this absurd, almost like love. There's no space for love, in the context of this world.
Yeah. I mean, it's
much better reading.
What does the bartender do? He keeps people sedated, I guess.
He keeps them dying. In the case of Doc Holliday, some champagne. Yeah. Cool. No, it is. For me, it's one of those, I don't know. If I were to teach a class about the Western or the noir, I think I would try and work in a moment. Like, I think I would even dig deeper it might be a cool class to do genre bending films or genre bending novel, whatever. And take things like Blade Runner or Alien and, maybe My Darling Clementine and other figures and look at how genres start to become expansive as much as they are, delimiting and defining. Alien being a perfect example where you got the sci-fi and the horror married in an interesting way. Here, in some ways, you have the elements of the noir married with that of the Western. And historically, as a context, that opens up some interesting, discussions about both.
Yeah. Good. All right.
Disco.
Yeah. So that's My Darling Clementine.
You heard it here first. When they start rewriting the book on that movie, you heard it here first.
All right. So where should we go next?
That's a good question. I mean, I would be interested. I mean, I haven't seen Lone Star in a while, but that's one I would actually like to look at. Like, I'd like to look at a contemporary Western, maybe.
Yeah,
that's maybe jump.
Yeah, I think that'd be good to look at, you know?
I'd love to look at Lone Star. It's been a while since I've seen it. I really liked it when I watched it. I'm a fan of John Sayles. I think he does interesting stuff. So, yeah, Lone Star would be one I'd be definitely interested in looking at.
Yeah, okay. Could do that then. Yeah.
Cool. Plus, we could talk about Texas.
Yeah.
And it always makes me think about a book that I haven't read that I want to read called The Lonesome Dove, which is supposedly another great Western that I have never read. You know, outside of Blood Meridian, people say it's one of the best. So that's one I'd love to. So we'll see. But it's big. It's very long.
Yeah.
It's like this. And when I look at a book like this, I tend to not read it.
I don't know. I mean, Elroy does those, and they can go through pretty quick. And
yeah, but Elroy, I mean, I was talking about, this is off topic, but I was talking about Elroy with a friend here in Italy who's an Elroy fan. And one of the things he said about Elroy that I tend to agree is, I like Elroy, but like after the Cold 6000, like with Perfidia or with Blood's a Rover, or like his books start to kind of be the same. Like his style really does start to congeal in ways. And he's done other things, like he's moved around and explored, but like, you know, I feel like when after I read White Jazz and LA Confidential and The American Tabloid, which may be the best, I was like, whoa, like this guy is at his peak. But I didn't get much more when I went to like Perfidia in particular, which I felt like Perfidia and Blood's a Rover, I felt like I read these. I just read these in different forms. So I wasn't nearly as excited as I was by his earlier stuff. And that might be just because he's doing what he does, but what he does can get old.
He found his groove and it turned into a rut, basically. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I still like his stuff, and I still think he's a refreshing writer, so I don't want to like diss him. But it wasn't the same experience I had when I was reading his stuff. Like, you know, American Tabloid or White Jazz or LA Confidential. Like, I was like blown away.
Yeah.
And that might just because I've had that experience already, but it's not like Perfidia or Blood's a Rover brought something completely new to it.
Right.
I felt like I was just reading the next chapter of American Tabloid or of the Cold 6000.
Yeah. He's got a lot to live up to, or he left himself a lot to live up to. Yeah.
He did. And I think like I was hoping like the 80s and the 90s stuff as he moved into that, if he did, would actually also change the style, right? And also like you get a different sense of how different media would inform a different style. But he stayed away from that. And he goes back always to what he's most comfortable with.
Yeah. Yeah. And like with Perfidia, and apparently there's going to be 2 more after that. He sort of boxed himself in because we know where those characters are going.
Exactly. You know? And like he went, rather than going forward, which I think would be really interesting, you know, like he's on the verge of that with Blood's a Rover. He kind of returns back to the LA he knows. And, you know, that's a choice artistically and otherwise. But like, I would really love to see him try and unveil some of the Reagan stuff with Salvador. Like, even if for just new content, I would be fascinated by that stuff, rather than a return to an LA he's done.
Yeah. I don't know. You want to make the money, you go with what people are buying. So
that's right.
Yeah.
Sex sells. All right, buddy.
All right.